Listen closely, friend. Her family didn't just get lost. They left her on purpose. 22 alone in a high mountain pass with a busted hip. No horse in sight, and a blinding blizzard roaring in fast. Hazel Frost stood frozen, watching those wagon ruts roll right out of her life. They didn't drag their boots either. They bolted, the kind of trail dust speed that says a man made a hard choice and wouldn't hear otherwise. They sent her fetching firewood, knew she'd be mighty slow. They planned the whole thing. If you've ever been tossed aside by the very kin who swore to protect you on this rugged earth, this frontier tale is for you. Stick around till the end. Hit like and holler in the comments where you are watching from. I want to see how far this trail winds. The storm rolled in quick, just like the deadliest gales always do up in the Cascade Range. No slow buildup, no gentle warning, just a bitter shift in the wind, and suddenly that sky turned the color of rusted iron across the whole horizon. Hazel felt that chill long before she saw it. She'd been working the tree line for 20 minutes, snapping dead limbs off the bottom branches of a thick stand of towering Douglas firs, stuffing the kindling into a heavy canvas sack slung across her shoulder. That mountain cold had already bitten right through her wool coat, settling deep into the muscles on her left side, which always locked up first. That busted hip never healed true after a wagon wreck 2 summers past. Her harsh stepmother just called it her bad side, like you'd talk about a rusted-out shovel. It was dragging now, aching fiercely, the way old frontier wounds do when the sky turns foul. She paused, squinting up through the heavy timber. The light was dead wrong. Too dim for mid-afternoon bleeding yellow. Out here, that meant heavy snow. Hazel was raised watching storms roll across the plains, reading the clouds like other young women read the good book. That bruised sky meant snow, and nothing gentle about it. That sky meant seek shelter now. She spun around and hobbled straight back toward their wagon. Her canvas sack was only half full, maybe 20 pounds of timber, barely enough for a freezing night, and nowhere near enough for the fury that sky was promising. Her stepmother Margaret laid down the law that morning. Fill that sack completely. Don't haul back anything less than a full load. We ain't wasting time stopping again. Hazel knew better than to cross Margaret over firewood or anything else on the trail. She moved as fast as her busted hip allowed, which wasn't very fast at all. The frontier terrain was treacherous, all jagged rocks under a dusting of old snow. Every 4th or 5th stride, that bum leg threatened to just buckle under her. She leaned heavily on a sturdy branch she'd found for a walking staff, driving it hard into the frozen dirt for balance. Dragging herself in a lurching, uneven rhythm she stopped being ashamed of a long time ago. Out west, shame was a luxury. Reaching camp was pure survival. She broke free of the timber into the clearing where they'd stopped, the spot where their wagon used to be. The rig was gone. For a heartbeat, Hazel just stood paralyzed, staring at that bare patch of earth like a riddling trail sign that just didn't make a lick of sense yet. The camp circle was maybe 60 feet wide, the dead prairie grass stomped flat by a bitter early frost. Deep ruts scarred the earth where the iron wheels had rested. There was a worn-down patch where their faithful pack mule, Old Bessie, stomped around all morning long. You could see boot tracks, dozens of them. Her stepbrothers, her wicked stepmother, and her father's heavy, wide-heeled boots. And there was just one set of little footprints, her own, wandering away from camp into the pines. But that heavy wagon was nowhere in sight. "Papa!" Her voice sounded much smaller than she wanted. She cleared her dusty throat and hollered again, a lot louder. "Papa!" Dead silence, just howling wind cutting through the pass, and the distant creak of tall firs. Hazel limped right to the center of the clearing. Those wagon ruts told the grim tale plain as day once she finally gathered the courage to study them. That heavy rig had been cranked around. The tracks proved Old Bessie backed up, turned hard, and pushed straight on eastward, deeper into the mountains, instead of heading back to civilization. She just stood there, gripping her canvas sack of kindling, staring down the very ruts leaving her behind. She tried convincing herself it was an accident. Maybe the biting wind spooked their mule, and her old man had to roll forward just to calm the beast. Maybe some trouble kicked up ahead and they just went down to investigate. Maybe one of her rowdy stepbrothers, Thomas or Cole, took a bad fall, forcing them to push ahead to find better shelter. She told herself those desperate lies, while her eyes slowly traced those deep wagon tracks across the frozen dirt. But you and I know the harsh truth about trail tracks in frozen mud. They never lie. They show a man's speed. They show his direction. They show you pure, cold intention. Pull up a chair, friend. Let's look at a harsh frontier truth. Those wagon ruts holding her family and everything she owned were rolling away. And they weren't laid down by panicked, spooked draft mules either. Those heavy timber wheels cut deep, even lines. The mule's gait was steady, slow, and totally controlled. Her own kin walked out on her. Deliberate, steady. Hazel just sank right down into that bitter snow. Didn't shed a tear. Not quite yet. She just sat on that frozen pioneer soil in the dead center of the clearing, staring at those eastbound ruts. For the longest time, she stayed frozen as the earth. Then that high country wind howled. First flakes started drifting down. Big, heavy ones, the kind any seasoned tracker knows brings a blizzard. That rough branch she leaned on for a walking stick just rested across her lap. She mulled over her father. Caleb Frost wasn't some cold-blooded brute. That's what she kept telling herself. He was spineless, sure, the sort of fellow who shut his mouth around Margaret, bowing to her harsh trail rules because nodding along was far easier than putting up a fight. But he wasn't downright evil. He loved his girl. She clung to that truth. He gripped her hand when her ma passed, and he stayed by her cot through the burning fever of their first solitary winter. He used to tell her in his soft-spoken drawl she was the spitting image of her mother, and he was mighty thankful she was his. She stared down those ruts. Her mind drifted back 3 weeks to a campfire whisper between Margaret and her pa, words a daughter was never, ever supposed to catch wind of. She was dozing under thick wool blankets in the wagon bed, but their harsh voices carried crisp and clear on that dead-still frontier night. The girl can't survive this mountain pass, Caleb. Not with a crippled leg. She'll drag us down and we'll freeze to death dragging her along. Sure, she is your daughter, but she is dead weight out here. You know it. We have 3 little ones to worry about. A long, heavy silence. Then came her father's voice, beaten down and bone-tired. I will think about it. Hazel swore to herself she heard it wrong. She figured it was just Margaret spitting venom the way that woman always did, and her pa would never cave, because there are some grim things a decent man simply will not do. She stared at those wagon ruts. She heard it perfectly. She spent her first lonesome night tucked under a fallen spruce right by the timberline. Dragging herself there burned up the last scraps of daylight. By the time she slithered under those pine boughs with her gathered kindling and one decent piece of flint, her jaw chattered, bone against bone, and her bad hip shifted from a dull ache to a wicked, grinding agony she just had to bite down and breathe through. She sparked a tiny campfire no bigger than her 2 hands together. That was all the fuel she could spare. Flames mean light, and light draws eyes. Out in this wild territory, you never know what kind of outlaws are riding the pass in November. She finished off her very last rations, half a morning biscuit baked so tough and stale it nearly snapped her tooth in half, alongside a tiny scrap of deer jerky buried deep in her wool coat. She gnawed on that tough meat awful slow, stretching out every bite. It wasn't enough to survive. Nowhere close to enough. Now you and I know panic kills out here, so she looked at her grim odds exactly the way a seasoned pioneer has to. Just plain logic, zero panic, checking her gear. What did she pack? 1 heavy wool duster, frayed but whole, thick leather trail boots just a size too large, thick stockings, a rugged canvas sling she could use for a sack, 20 pounds of dry wood to buy her maybe 2 bitter nights of warmth, a solid steel striker, and a little folding blade tucked safely in her pocket. She carried it since she was 14, never figuring she would cut more than saddle rope. Add 1 tin cup. 0 grub. No water unless she scooped up snow to melt over the embers. What did she desperately need to hike out of this ragged high country before the real blizzards hit? She peeked up at the storm clouds tearing through the pines. Those storm fronts were sinking low, moving mighty fast, carrying that dark, loaded menace that only the deadliest winter squalls bring. She figured she had 1 sunrise left, maybe 2 if the Lord showed mercy. And frankly, the frontier hadn't shown her much mercy lately. Come dawn, she swore to track those wagon ruts heading east, not because she ever thought her flesh and blood would turn around for her. She buried that fool's hope already. She just knew heading east meant surviving this deadly mountain pass. Might be a dusty outpost at the bottom, might be fur trappers, weary travelers, anybody? Or there could just be empty wilderness. She tossed her final heavy chunks of timber onto those weak embers, hugged her cold knees tight against her chest, and prayed for daylight. She barely caught a wink. The mountain frost just wouldn't let her rest. She kept snapping awake to nurse the coals, shifting her weight every time that broken hip flared up like a wild, echoing scream inside her bones. And every time she jolted awake, you and I can picture the terror. Pitch black night, miles from a single living soul, facing the brutal reality of being completely, utterly alone. Gather round, folks. Let's step onto the trail. Hazel thought about Thomas, 16 years old, sporting her same dark hair. The boy who taught her how to whistle, staring her down as she walked into the trees with a look she just couldn't figure out. She thought about young Cole, who was 13, and carried that specific frontier meanness, the kind a boy learns from his mother before the tough world forces him to unlearn it. She remembered Margaret's rigid jawline, the way that woman had glared at Hazel's busted leg, calculating the sheer cost of dead weight on a wagon train. She thought about her father, but no tears fell. Out on the trail, crying costs precious water and warmth, and she couldn't afford to spend either one. Fresh snow buried most wagon tracks when she headed east that morning. Still, she spotted the faint grooves where heavy wheels had cut through the dirt. She trailed them as best she could, limping slowly, stopping constantly to rest that bad hip. By high noon, she had to dump her heavy firewood. It was dead weight, her freezing hands unable to grip the sling anymore. Dropping that wood felt like surrendering the very last piece of hope she carried. The wilderness snow was falling steadily now. Not a roaring mountain blizzard yet, but a relentless wet snow that slipped down her collar, melted on her skin, and froze solid whenever the western wind howled. Her coat was drenched by midday. Early afternoon soaked straight to the bone. Come sundown, she wasn't even sure if she still followed those pioneer ruts, or if she had wandered blindly off into the deep timber. She paused in a small clearing to find her bearings. East was still east. Those towering peaks loomed above. The mountain pass had to empty out eventually. But the frontier chill was stealing her body heat, just like an old trapper described back at her daddy's Kansas trading post a solid 3 years prior. You stop shivering when you're in real trouble, he had warned her. Shivering means your body is fighting. When it stops, you're out of fight. She was still shaking, though, just barely. She kept pushing forward. As daylight faded on that second brutal day, she realized the grim truth. She wasn't making it out of this high country alive. Now, folks, she understood this the way a pioneer does when the panic burns out. Clearly. Completely emotionless, like reading a trail map. The distance was too great. The frostbite too deep. That injured leg went from dragging to buckling every few paces. She had fallen twice this past hour. The second tumble took several grueling minutes to recover from. The third fall she reckoned might be her last. She drank melted snow and hadn't eaten a scrap since yesterday. The hunger had shifted past a gnawing bellyache into something mighty quiet and much more deadly. Her sharp mind was stalling. That was the true tragedy. She always possessed a quick, sharp wit, and she took pride in that. Her mother used to call her a little hawk, always watching the horizon, always turning complex problems over. But now her sluggish mind kept circling back to empty space. She found a hollow shelter between two giant boulders, settling against the freezing granite. She wasn't building any campfire. She had 0 wood, and even if she did, she doubted she had the steadiness left to strike a flint spark. Her fingers were far past numb. They had crossed into a deadness where she felt absolutely nothing. She rested her heavy head against the stone, thinking, "I don't want to die." It hit her with mild surprise, like observing some strange piece of frontier trivia. She had been far too exhausted, too frozen, and too laser-focused on basic wilderness survival to feel much of anything for 2 whole days. But there it finally was, rising right through the mental fog. "I don't want to die. I am 22, never seen the world or done anything grand, and I refuse to die in this snow." The thought led nowhere useful. She was perishing in that bitter snow whether she wanted to or not. The rugged mountain didn't care about her dreams. The wind died. Snow fell straight down now, thick and heavy, piling onto her coat, dusting her hair, and capping her leather boots. And she knew deep down that if she just sat there, the wilderness would bury her. And come tomorrow morning, we know she'd look just like another snow-covered boulder. She knew it too, but couldn't force her body to budge. Then she caught something, not a sound exactly, more like a sudden shift in the dead quiet, an eerie absence of noise, a pause in the settling snow, making her realize something out in her untamed world had changed. Slowly she opened her eyes. Picture this. A massive shadow loomed over her, blocking out that heavy snow-choked sky. She never heard his boots. That meant the snow was thick enough to swallow sound, and she'd been sitting there way too long. Slow as molasses, that dark shape turned into a man. He stood mighty tall, broad across the shoulders, no fat on him. Just the solid bulk a man gets from years of hard frontier labor in the freezing cold. He wore a thick fur hide, the sort stitched together by hand out in the wild, rough on the eyes, but warm as a furnace. A dark beaver pelt hat sat low on his brow. He carried a rifle on his back and held something dead in his left hand. In that fading winter light, she just couldn't tell what. A thick scarf wrapped twice around his jaw hid most of his face. He stared right down at her, and she stared right back. For a breathless second, neither soul twitched. Then he crouched down, real slow like you'd approach a spooked Mustang. Only she was way too frozen to run anywhere. She saw his eyes dark, calculating. They swept over her the way a tracker studies a fresh trail trying to make sense of things. "You alive?" His voice was a low grumble, rough as crushed gravel under a boot. "Yes," Hazel said. The word sounded clumsy and thick. Her frozen lips barely worked. "You alone?" "Yes." He studied her hard for another long second. He glanced up, scanning the tall pines and the fast-falling snow. Whatever Western arithmetic he was doing in his head, he finally reached an answer. "Can you walk?" She tried to shift her freezing legs. Her hip locked up instantly, forcing a sharp gasp from her throat. Not exactly a scream, just one of those sudden noises a hurting body makes on its own. "No," she breathed. He checked out her busted leg, then met her eyes. Without uttering another word, the stranger dropped whatever he was holding in his left hand. A stiff, frozen fox, as it turned out. He unslung his heavy rifle and laid it aside. Getting low, he slid his arms under her knees and behind her back. "This will hurt," he muttered. Between us, that was the most honest thing anyone had told her in a long while. And Lord, did it hurt. Moving that leg fired a white-hot lightning bolt straight up her spine, turning the edges of her vision pitch black. She let out that same helpless, ragged gasp. He did not stop, nor did he say sorry. He just hoisted her up, grabbing the rifle and the fox in one smooth move that proved he was mighty used to carrying things that fought back. Then he started walking. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Cabin." "How far?" "Far enough." She wanted to demand answers. "Who are you? What do you want? Is this really better than freezing out here in the snow?" But the bitter cold had stolen away most of her words, and riding over his shoulder kept grinding her hip into a brutal, steady ache that took up every ounce of her attention. She watched snowflakes drift past his hat brim. She listened to his breathing, steady calm, the rhythm of a frontiersman who knew the meaning of hard labor. The tall timber rolled by. The wild world was white-gray and fading fast. She told herself, "At least I'm not dying out in the snow." Then it hit her. Maybe I am just dying somewhere else. After that, her mind just went completely dark for a good long while. She drifted back to herself piece by piece. Warmth hit her first. You and I both know that deep, roaring heat you feel in your bones. The kind you only understand after surviving a deadly winter freeze. Then the smells. Wood smoke, rich pine resin, damp fur, and something brewing that smelled like strong coffee or boiling shoe leather. Then came sound. Fire, the crackle and snap of dry timber burning hot in a stone hearth. Then came the pain. Her broken hip was throbbing like a furious volcano. Her fingers and toes tingled and burned as the frozen blood finally started rushing back to her limbs. She knew that was a good sign, even though it hurt like hell. She opened her eyes to see rough-hewn timber right above her. She laid on a sturdy wooden cot piled high with heavy pelts. The cabin was tiny enough that she could take in the whole place from her bed. A massive stone fireplace dominated an entire wall of the room. A rough table flanked by 2 chairs and walls stacked with tin cans, dried provisions, traps, and strange frontier gear hidden in the shadowy light. "Pull up a chair, folks." Just one window covered in oilcloth bleeding a cold gray light. Just a heavy timber door and a cast-iron wood stove simmering. Rafters hung heavy with rusty traps, dried sage, coiled rope. And down below, a dog sat 3 feet from her bunk, staring with that cold, unblinking focus you only see in giant hounds and dying men. A massive beast, folks, bound to have plenty of wild wolf blood. Ghostly gray coat, piercing yellow eyes, and a dead calm stare that chilled her bones way worse than a snarl ever could. Hazel and the hound locked eyes. "He won't bother you unless I say the word." She snapped her head around. A fella stood by the hearth, back turned, tending that iron pot. He'd shed his thick fur and worn hat. His dark hair was streaked with frost, grown out wild, and tied back rough right at the base of his neck. Shorn of that coat, he was still a mountain of a man. Broad, long-armed, carrying jagged scars down his neck straight into his collar. "What's his name?" she rasped, throat thick as mud. The man glanced back at the hound. "Grim. Grim." She chewed on that. The hound's tail gave one heavy, lazy sweep across the floorboards, then froze. "Strange name to give." "It's his name." Hazel just stared back up at those timber rafters. "What's yours?" Silence stretched, spanned so long she figured the man had swallowed his tongue. "Stone. Is that your first name or your last?" "Last." "Then what's the first?" More dead silence. "Garrett. Garrett Stone." She turned her weary head his way. He was pouring stew into a tin cup. "I'm Hazel Frost." He crossed the floorboards and handed it down. Looked like some kind of bone broth. Thin stuff. Mostly boiling water, carrying a muddy color, smelling more like survival than a Sunday dinner. She tried rising, but her busted hip screamed out a harsh warning. He just stood there, watching her fight through the pain. Only when she finally wedged herself upright against those rough-hewn logs did he offer the tin cup again. "Drink it slow." She took it, both hands shaking. Her numb fingers felt like cold, dead wood. That watery, salted broth was absolute heaven. Best thing to hit her tongue in a month of Sundays. She sipped it slow, like he ordered. "Thank you," she whispered. But his back was already to the flames. "Well then." She faded out. Waking the second time, bright sun pushed through the oilcloth. Morning. She'd gone and lost a whole day somewhere in the dark. Somebody had built the fire back up. The mighty hound was gone, but she heard him, or figured she did, pacing soft and quiet right over by the front door. "Stick with me here." Garrett sat at the table, twisting snare wire with a hand tool, rigging up a hunting trap. His calloused hands moved smooth and steady, like a man who'd tied that same knot 10,000 times before. She studied him silent for a spell. Older than she figured at first glance. Past 40 if she had to bet, maybe pushing 45. Those jagged neck scars stood out harsh in the daylight, trailing all the way up behind his left ear like a road map. When he leaned over to grab a tool off the rough timber table, his face looked sunbaked and stony, the way hermits get after years alone in the wild. How long was I out? He never broke focus from the wire. Part of yesterday, all last night. What day is it? Wednesday. He muttered it like out here days of the week didn't mean a lick of sense, which honestly they probably didn't. "I need to," she waved her hand. He dropped the snare and stood tall. "Door's yonder. Use the porch corner. I'll haul you out." "I can manage." "You can't." He said it dead flat. No malice, just stating a cold, hard fact of nature. "You'll bust open on those steps." She wanted to fight him, but the shooting pain in her hip did the arguing for him right quick. He hauled her outside with rough speed, handled her like a wounded calf, an absolute chore, but something a man's gotta do. He gave her a minute alone, then hauled her back inside. Not a single word spoken about any of it. Now Hazel was mighty grateful for that. Needing a hand just to survive strips away a person's dignity, and in this harsh Western country, she had precious little left to lose anyway. Once she finally settled back onto that rough cot, she breathed through the sharp hip pain, trying not to feel helpless. The trapper walked over to the cast-iron stove and brought back a small bowl of something that actually looked like real grub, mostly beans and some dried meat. Over the next 2 days, Hazel quietly sized up what she could about this fella, Garrett Stone. He wasn't one to give away secrets. Hell, he barely gave away a single word. But look, she was sharp. Growing up, she'd learned to read the empty spaces between folks' words, so she watched his every move like a hawk. It didn't take long to see he was a wilderness trapper. You could tell by the hanging pelts, the steel traps scattered about, and the thick, raw smell of the cabin. It carried a wild animal scent she was slowly just getting used to. He ran wilderness trap lines somewhere up in the high country. She figured this out just by watching him pack his gear before heading into the snow and seeing what he hauled back. The man knew his trade. You could see it in those prime hides, and how he worked without wasting a single breath. He'd survived out here alone for years. This old log cabin felt like it had never held space for more than a lone drifter. Just one chair facing the hearth, one tin cup, one plate. Every single item was placed perfectly for a man of his exact height and rough reach. No dusty tin types, no faded letters. Not a single keepsake tied him to another soul. Just the grim, everyday business of surviving the wild. Day 2, she noticed his right knee was busted up. He didn't limp, though. He'd long outgrown a regular limp, but she saw how he shifted his weight standing up from the fire, and how he took those porch steps favoring that bad right leg. Not a fresh injury, just a worn old survival habit. She knew better than to ask about a man's scars out here. Come the 3rd day, she figured she'd try standing alone to grab something off a high shelf. She got to her feet, shuffled the 6 paces across the floor timbers, and reached for her tin cup. Right then, her busted hip just quit on her, and she hit the dirt hard. She managed to grab the edge of that wooden shelf, which wasn't nailed too firm into the logs. The whole thing, along with the cup and half his supplies, came crashing down around her. Sat right there in the scattered mess, she just gritted her teeth, waiting for that blinding hip pain to finally settle into something manageable. Garrett suddenly filled the doorway, his hunting rifle in hand, quietly sizing up the disaster. She glared up. "I'm perfectly fine." He stared at her, glanced at the busted shelf and spilled gear, then back again. "You're not fine," he muttered. "I'm sitting down voluntarily," she snapped. "Call it a floor meditation, mighty fashionable back east." He propped his rifle, gathered the mess, and hammered the shelf back into the logs with 2 heavy iron nails. He picked up the dented cup, setting it on the table. Then he offered his hand. She grabbed hold, and he hoisted her up in one clean motion. "Don't do that again," he grunted. "What? Grab my own cup?" "Fall." She wanted to snap back that it wasn't a choice, but he was already walking away. She reckoned she understood his meaning. No scolding there. Just cold frontier practicality. He'd hauled her from the freezing snow, spending real sweat keeping her alive. Busting herself up again just threatened his hard-earned investment. She wasn't human to him yet, just some heavy burden he'd hauled home. She sank onto the cot, staring at the floorboards, thinking, well, that's fine. I've always been nothing but a burden to everyone anyway. You and I know that wasn't strictly true. He carried her through a blizzard when he could have just let her freeze. Come day 4, that hip worked well enough to shuffle around the cabin. Her mind was finally clearing up, too ready to start planning her next move. She needed to suss out exactly where she stood now. She bided her time till dusk, right when Garrett dragged in from the trapline to eat. Pacing like a caged coyote all day, she finally sat herself in the extra chair, the same one he'd glared at when she dared to move it earlier. The stony look a man gives something that sat dead still in one spot for years until its place is sheer law. She took a breath and said, "I need to know what this arrangement is." He just studied her over his supper. Let me tell you, he had this raw, unblinking stare completely hollow of any emotion a person could rightly read. You and I know that unsettling frontier silence. "What is?" he asked. "This. My staying here. What you're expecting. The actual terms." The man laid his spoon down. "Terms. You found me out there, brought me inside. You've kept my belly full. I figure that carries a price." A shadow crossed his rugged face, but no anger. He wasn't the sort to get easily riled anyway. It looked more like he just understood. "What kind of price are you fretting over?" he asked. "The obvious one." He just stared at her. "No," he told her straight. "Meaning you don't have them, or you won't act on them?" "No to both." He grabbed his spoon again. "You're battered, and nobody crosses these snowy mountains until the spring thaw anyway. I ain't aiming to add to your misery." She studied his weathered face. He just kept eating. Out west, that usually means a man set his peace and won't be jawing any further. "All right," she told him. "What do you need from me?" "I can't just warm that cot, eat your grub, and not pull my weight. I just won't do it." He eyed her for a second. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you mend clothes?" "Yes." "Can you stay out of my way when I'm working?" "Depends on how much room you take up." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a grin, just a silent nod that he was taking her measure. "There's our bargain," he said. "You cook, mend, and tend the hearth. I hunt, check the traps, and keep the roof up. And come springtime, come spring you ride out." She nodded. Fair enough. He went right back to his stew. She watched him, then blurted out, "My family left me out here." She hadn't planned that. It just spilled out the way secrets do when they've been buried far too long. "They sent me out to gather firewood. Then they packed up and vanished while my back was turned. My father, My stepmother, my 2 stepbrothers, they just abandoned me." The trapper didn't say a single word. He didn't look away, which was rare out here. Most folks flinch at tragedy. "I found their tracks," she told him. "They didn't panic or get spooked by the mules. They made a deliberate choice." Heavy silence filled the room. "I'm telling you so you know I won't do anything foolish, like trying to chase them down or—" Her voice cracked. "I just needed to tell someone." I hadn't said the awful truth out loud yet. Garrett stayed quiet for a long stretch, then finally grumbled. "Eat your supper." She just blinked. He tipped his chin toward the stove. "There's more in that pot. You haven't eaten nearly enough today." It wasn't exactly pioneer sympathy. It was something far more primal than that. A silent understanding that you are breathing, and the breathing must continue. And to her honest surprise, that gritty comfort was enough. She stood up and scraped more beans from the kettle. Her injured hip held steady. She sat back down and ate. "But you and I know out here, the winter storm always finds you." Wind lashed snow against that oilcloth window, making the hearth flames dance wild. But inside the fire burned true. The rough timber cabin was tiny, smelling of rusty iron traps, wet dog, and thick wood smoke. She ate her fill. She was breathing. Out on the frontier, that was everything. That first full week in the cabin nearly broke her spirit far worse than the biting frost. Staying alive has its own brutal logic. Keep warm, stay fed, keep moving. That she understood. But here's the thing we both know. The real test is surviving alongside a rugged loner, a man speaking mostly in silence, expecting you to guess the rest. Garrett Stone simply didn't explain his ways. He offered no excuses for his daily chores, his harsh moods, or his stubborn reasons for doing things exactly the way he pleased. He executed his duties in the exact same order, strictly by the rhythm of the sun. If you were standing in his path, you learned mighty fast to step aside. The man was out of bed before dawn. She knew this because she'd wake to the iron stove being stoked and the soft clicking of Grimm's paws as the hound trailed him to the heavy door. By the time morning sun bled through that oilcloth window pane, old Garrett was already long gone. Working the deep snow trap lines, she reckoned, judging by the raw pelts he carried back in and the gear he left behind. He'd hike back by mid-afternoon, maybe earlier if a blizzard howled. He spent the dying daylight right on the porch, mending his rugged frontier equipment, skinning the day's catch, and tackling the endless gritty chores that keeping a wilderness cabin standing demands. Man ate twice a day, spoke even less. He drifted through that cabin like a lone wolf, so used to the solitude he forgot how to make room for anyone else breathing his air. Hazel watched the fella, took mental notes, and started figuring out how to pull her own weight. First morning she found the strength to stand up by that old iron stove, she decided to fix up a real proper frontier breakfast. Pickings were mighty slim, but she scraped together some cornmeal salt and rendered fat. She whipped up some hoe cakes on a dusty iron griddle that hadn't seen a fire in months. She heard Garrett stomping around out in the snow, coming back from checking his trap line. He stepped inside, freezing, dead in his tracks at the smell of real grub. He stared hard at the plate on that wooden table. Then he stared right at her. "Sit," she told him. "They're going to get cold." The man sat. Downed 3 of them in dead silence. Finally, he rumbled, "There's molasses in the tin on the second shelf." "I saw it. I wasn't sure if you were saving it," she replied. "Not for anything particular." She fetched the tin, and he drowned his last hoe cake in syrup before finishing it. She sat across from him quietly eating her meal. She already knew what any seasoned pioneer knows. You cannot force a conversation with a stubborn, silent frontiersman like Garrett Stone. Words either flowed or they didn't. That morning silence won out. But those hoe cakes were wiped clean off his plate. Heading back out, he never uttered a single thank you. But he didn't say quit cooking either, which out here in the wild meant practically the same thing. She spent the rest of her morning taking a hard, careful inventory of the cabin's grub, keeping mental tallies since paper was scarce. Now you and I know a winter pantry can be a grim sight, and hers surely was. Mostly dried meat, venison, maybe some tough rabbit, alongside a few dusty cans of beans and stewed tomatoes. She found cornmeal, a pinch of flour, and dried apples turning tough as old boot leather. Plus salt, which on the trail is worth its weight in gold. Barely enough coffee beans, some rendered fat, one single glass jar of thick honey, a tiny, pitiful sack of rice. She stared down the long, bitter weeks of deep winter ahead, knowing 2 hungry mouths burn through chuck faster than one. She ran the bleak math in her head, and the odds did not look pretty. Garrett tramped back in that afternoon, holding a fresh brace of rabbits. She'd heard him scouting the North Ridge, but kept her worries about the dwindling rations completely to herself. But come nightfall, she cooked up a rabbit stew, stretching the meat way further than it ought to go with those beans. She didn't waste a scrap, tossing every bare bone right back into the iron pot to boil down for broth. Oh, he noticed all right. She saw his sharp eyes flick from that simmering pot straight to her, wearing that same calculating stare a tracker gets when reading sign. Man kept his peace, just ate. She was starting to learn that with a roughneck like Garrett, clearing the plate was high praise. The real burr in the saddle was the cabin itself. Built for a lone drifter, it held the two of them with all the grudging mercy of a shrinking leather boot. There was that narrow rope cot she slept on. His cot. She realized the truth when she spotted him rolling out a rough blanket, a pallet on the floorboards by the hearth, not complaining once. She'd immediately insisted he take his bed back, but he just grunted, claiming he slept better down on the hard timber, which was a flat-out lie. Still, she knew fighting a stubborn mule like him was completely pointless. They had a sturdy table and 2 chairs, finally doing the job they were built for. But everything else, the heavy stove, the wooden shelves, the chopping block, were all laid out for a solitary man who had his daily chores whittled down to a perfect science. Now, let me tell you that setup made 0 sense for 2 folks trying to survive the winter without stepping on each other's spurs. They bumped right into one another 3 times that first week. Nothing dramatic, just the awkward fumbling of 2 strangers learning the clumsy dance of sharing a small claim. First time, she was turning from the fire while he reached for the pantry shelf. They collided dead center over a jar of precious salt, and she stepped right backward onto his heavy boot. "Sorry," she muttered. He stayed completely mute, just sidestepping around her, but that second time was far worse. She was grabbing for the heavy water bucket just as he busted through the door, the wicked winter wind whipping it wide open. The shock made her twist around fast, and that healing hip of hers screamed out in pure agony at the sudden motion. She crumpled down to one knee, letting out a pained gasp she despised, but he was there, like lightning, catching her arm in an iron grip, bearing her full weight before she even hit the floorboards. She caught her balance. He released her and stepped away quick like he'd grabbed a hot iron by pure frontier instinct and deeply regretted it. "I'm fine," she said. Got the words out before he could eye her leg with that calculating frontier stare. "You twisted it." "I didn't twist it. I stumbled. It's different." Truth is, it didn't sound a lick different. She drew a breath, pulled herself tall, and met his gaze dead on. He stood barely 3 feet away, and inside that small pioneer cabin, the man looked even more massive than he did out in the snow, taking up half the room just by breathing. "I got a bad hip," she told him flatly. "It ain't gonna heal up. It's just my lot. I'd oblige you to quit watching it like it's suddenly bound to become your burden out here." Something changed in his rugged face. Not anger exactly. More like a man recalculating a trail he thought he knew. "It's already my problem if you fall and can't work," he muttered. Now that was such a purely practical cold-weather answer, she nearly chuckled. Nearly. "Fair point," she finally answered. "I'll be careful." And she was. She started stepping different around that cramped room, taking her corners a little wider, keeping one hand free to grab a timber shelf or the table, always mindful of where her boots met the floorboards. This wasn't a fresh affliction. She'd been wrestling that bad hip since she came of age. You and I know how the wilderness makes you reckless. During her worst survival days in the snow, she pushed through the agony instead of working with it. Now she had to relearn the hard business of managing that limp. As for Garrett, he started doing something quiet she didn't catch on to for days. He began moving things around. Nothing loud, nothing that drew attention to the deed, but she'd reach for an iron pot and find it waiting on a lower shelf. Or she'd fetch water and see the bucket shifted to a spot she could easily reach, sparing her the painful stretching that caused her fall. Little silent adjustments that made living in that log cabin a slightly easier truce with her own busted body. She mulled over calling him out on it. Wisely decided to stay quiet, acknowledging it might spook his pride. Now their third run-in was completely her doing. She was trying to patch his spare coat. He kept two, a heavy buffalo skin for bitter blizzards, and a lighter working duster for daily chores. That lighter canvas had a ragged tear down the back seam, stitched up poorly by clumsy hands, and ripping wide open once more. She dug out a needle and heavy thread from his gear and got working. So dead focused on throwing those stitches, she never heard the man step back inside from the cold. When he reached to grab that coat off the wall peg, right as she grabbed it too, the two of them ended up sharing a sliver of the exact same space. She felt his body heat before she truly knew he was there. Smelled of frost, pine sap wood smoke, and wild frontier dirt she couldn't place. She jumped back right quick, gripping the coat, and he took a step back too. For a fleeting second, both of them were just staring, recalibrating the tension. "I was fixing it," she stammered. "The seam would have torn clean open if left alone." He glanced at the ragged coat in her hands, then right into her eyes. "You don't have to do that." "I know. I wanted to." She took a breath. Whoever sewed that seam last didn't know a lick about stress points. "It'll weather the frontier better if I stitch it right." He just stood there silent. "What do you know about mending canvas?" "My mother was a proper seamstress." She held up the fabric to show off the first 6 inches of solid handiwork she'd done. "She taught me every trick she knew. Probably the finest seamstress within 50 miles of this godforsaken stretch of wilderness." The corner of his rough mouth twitched into that ghost of a smile. "Probably," he muttered. She sat right back down, needle flashing. He stepped past her toward the cast-iron stove. "Now listen close." As he poured his coffee, she realized that was the most talking she'd pulled out of him since they made their deal. Small frontier victories. You take what you can get. Soon their days found a steady, unyielding rhythm, not exactly warm, but mighty functional. Hazel cooked, and by God she cooked well, which made her mighty valuable in a rough survival camp like this. That girl had a pure gift for making a handful of scraps stretch further than a Sunday sermon. She learned that trade back at a dusty trading post kitchen back when silver was scarce, which was always. You and I might know ledgers, but she knew the arithmetic of food like a banker knows gold. She boiled tough jerky into rich stews, mixing animal fat, ground cornmeal, and dried apples into hearty pioneer meals that kept the cold away. Now listen here. She rationed that coffee with the iron discipline of a soul who knew the wagon train wasn't coming back. She stitched up every single busted seam, and Lord knows this place needed fixing. Garrett treated his gear like a stubborn mule, patching his duds just enough to keep out the winter chill and not a lick more. Sleeves unstable buttons, and heavy wool breeches darned so many times the thread itself was giving up the ghost. His boot liners were stitched with rawhide strips. Sure, it held them together, but it did absolutely nothing to keep out the frost. She tackled it all like clockwork. Every dawn when he geared up, she watched him notice, just for a quiet second, that his old ragged clothes actually fit right and moved easy. He never said thanks. She never expected it. She just kept that stove burning, which was tougher than it sounds. Chopped timber had to be hauled from the front porch, and she had to cycle the green logs near the heat so they'd dry before freezing up. That fire was a stubborn bronc shifting with the wind and the chimney draft. Taming the flames took pure frontier skill and keeping a mighty close watch. She caught its rhythm. She never walked outside alone. Garrett never spoke the rule. He barely spoke at all. But she knew the score. The deep powder outside meant business, and the wild country past that clearing was a mystery. With her bum leg, she wouldn't last a mile in those drifts. She had the grit to face those facts, even if being caged up like a wildcat was eating at her pride. Hazel was a drifter at heart, always itching to push forward, eager to see what lay hidden beyond the next dusty ridge. Sitting idle made her crazy. Those heavy timber walls kept them alive, but they felt like a trap. Now that dog Grim helped in his own quiet way. Sometime around week 2, the old hound reckoned Hazel wasn't half bad to have around. He showed it by dragging his bones away from the cold door, settling down right near her cot, planting himself squarely in her neck of the woods. He didn't beg for scratches, but he didn't snap either. When Garrett was out hunting, she caught herself spinning yarns to that old dog through the long afternoons. Just chewing the fat, jawing away because an empty cabin carries a hollow kind of quiet. Not like the heavy quiet when Garrett was around. She just needed a living voice, even her own. One lazy afternoon, she was preaching to Grim about how mighty those peaks must look when the summer wild grass finally blooms, when the hound suddenly snapped to attention, eyeing the solid door. 2 minutes early, Garrett's heavy boots stomped the porch boards. Hazel froze right mid-word. Old Grim gave a single wag of his tail. Garrett pushed inside, kicked powder off his boots, and hung his coat. He sized up Grim, then her. He'd caught the tail end of her rambling. "Just talking to the dog," she blurted out, beating him to the draw before he could ask. He won't answer back. He listens well. Garrett tossed his hat. Only when he feels like it. Otherwise, he's just dreaming of chasing jackrabbits. She eyed the dog, who looked as blank as a slate. Can't blame him. The heavy tension in that cabin lifted just a hair, a fraction lighter. It was the closest thing to peace she'd felt since crossing that threshold. She tucked the moment away without pushing her luck, chewing on it later. Now you and I know how the frontier gets at night. Fire burns down Garrett snoring on his bedroll. The cabin pitch black except for those glowing orange coals. She pondered how wild it is what plain survival does to folks. How it builds a fortress between two strangers, and then slowly, without anyone saying a word, that fortress grows a creaky little door. Not swung open yet, just a door, a quiet possibility. She didn't know what to make of it. She also couldn't stop noticing things about him that had absolutely nothing to do with staying alive. Like the rough way his hands moved while working, moving with a sharp precision seen in folks who learned their trade the hard way out of pure need instead of fancy schooling. Or how he sat with his busted knee kicked out, a deep-rooted habit the man likely had zero clue he even did. The wicked scar vanishing down his collar, and that little jagged mark sitting right at the edge of his left eyebrow. We've all seen fellas with broken noses, right? His healed crooked, giving his rough face a lopsided charm that somehow made him a whole lot more fascinating to look at. She tracked these details like she checked the cabin, supplies practical, thorough, and without a lick of judgment. That's what she kept telling herself anyway. Now listen here. Hard truths come out slow. Guarded folks never face you straight. They always talk sideways. She figured out he rode into these high peaks 11 years back, never setting foot back east since. He didn't just come out and say it. He dropped a hint about a rough winter, and she did the frontier math in her head. She realized he raised that timber cabin with his own too, hands which explained the rock-solid frame and rough-hewn edges. The bones held strong, but pretty details were left out in the cold. She learned his hound Grim was 5, and that there was another good dog long before him. Garrett brought it up exactly once. The heavy way he spoke told her that losing that old dog was a grief that never truly fades away. She knew better than to pry for more. She learned quick that pushing Garrett didn't get you answers. He'd just go silent, draw back into the shadows, and that open door became a stone wall again. What she didn't ask about was the ghost that chased him up this mountain and kept him anchored here. The ugly scar, the heavy silence, those 11 years hiding out, it all painted a dark picture she could feel but couldn't quite see. And out west, you learn never to dig into another man's hidden past. Folks share their burdens when the time is right. In return for his grudging shelter, she gave him pure, quiet, hard work. Out here, survival is currency. Every hot meal she cooked was miles better than his lonely bachelor grub. Every torn shirt came back stitched strong, instead of just barely holding on. And every night the hearth fire roared, with coffee water boiling hot the second he dragged himself in from the freezing trail. That grit was all she had to give, and she handed it over without a single demand. She hid her tears, burying the heavy sorrow of what her own blood had done to her. She kept that pain locked deep down mostly. It only slipped out deep in the night, when the mountain wind howled and the blackness swallowed the cabin whole. Or on those bitter days when her bad hip flared up, stopping her from pulling her own weight around the homestead. She'd get sharp on those days. But Garrett, like a wild Mustang, sensed her pain without a single word spoken, giving her a wide berth and demanding nothing. He wasn't exactly a gentleman, but he wasn't a cruel one either. You and I both know that in a rugged drifter, that difference means everything. Around the end of her second week, she sat darning some thick wool socks that somehow managed to blow out both heels at the exact same time, which honestly takes a special kind of stubborn walking. Over at the table, Garrett was working a piece of leather with an awl, fixing up a busted snowshoe strap. The hearth fire crackled warm. For the first time in days, the fierce gale outside finally died down to a low whistle, giving those battered oilcloth windows a rest. Without even lifting her eyes from the needle, she asked, "Do you ever miss it, back east?" He chewed on that. She waited. Finally, he grunted. "Some things." "Like what?" The cabin went dead quiet, save for that awl punching the tough hide. "Better coffee," he mumbled. She snorted. Totally by accident. The sound just slipped right out of her. Next thing, she was laughing out loud, something she hadn't done in a month of Sundays. That bright laugh echoed off the timber roof. It felt too big and sounded mighty rusty from disuse. He just watched her. No smile. "Sorry," she whispered, finally swallowing back her sudden fit of chuckles. "I just wasn't expecting you to say that." "What were you expecting?" "I don't know. Maybe a girl? A town? Something deep?" "Coffee is deep," he replied, "when it's brewed right." She went back to fixing that sock. A warm smile stayed on her face, safe now since his eyes were back on his work. "Fair enough," she said. The fire popped, and old Grim sighed from the hearth. Outside, the jagged mountain peak finally settled into a deep, peaceful quiet. And inside that rough-hewn shack, two scarred souls sat in their own quiet corners. Not too close, but no longer strangers. The night ticked on. It wasn't quite friendship yet, but it sure was the good iron ore needed to forge it. She finished stitching that heel bit off the thread and picked up the second sock. Her worn hands didn't shake once. Her bad hip wasn't aching. The fire burned bright. Listen to me. She was alive. And tonight, for the first time in weeks, that felt like a mighty blessing. Listen, friend. Winter up in the high timber doesn't just peak and fade like it does down in the flatlands. It stacks. Every blizzard piles right on top of the last, packing that snow into a slick, deadly crust that makes the bitter cold bite right through to your bones. By the time what Garrett called the deep winter finally rolled in around mid-December, by Hazel's best reckoning, the world outside, that cabin had twisted into a frozen wasteland where folks just weren't meant to survive. But she had settled into them, the rhythm of it, or at least as much as a body ever could. The long days had their shape now, pitch-black mornings, long, quiet hours inside, while Garrett checked his trap lines, and afternoons where the tiny cabin shrank around 2 people and one massive dog just trying to share the space. She figured out how that iron stove burned when the wind howled from the north instead of the east. She noticed Grim's ears would pin back right before Garrett's boots even struck, the porch wood giving her about 30 seconds of warning. A warning she found mighty useful for reasons she didn't care to unpack just yet. She also learned the different silences of Garrett Stone. There was his working silence, heavy, laser-focused, and having absolutely nothing to do with her. Then you had his eating silence, just a rugged man who figured talking ruined a good meal and made 0 apologies for it. But there was a third kind of quiet she caught in the evenings. When the chores were done, the fire crackled hot, and neither of them had a single task left to do. A hush that didn't feel empty, but rather alive with a heavy presence. Like a man stopping on the trail without knowing why his boots quit moving. She never named it. Putting a name to a feeling is the quickest way to spook it away. Instead, she just talked. Never any empty chatter. She was never the gossipy type. It was that slow drifting kind of talk that grows between 2 folks who drop their guard but haven't yet figured out what comes next. She told him tales of growing up out in Kansas, her mother's little sewing shop, and the rich smell of it. Hot irons, heavy starch, and that crisp, sweet smell of brand new cotton. She told him about the old trading post, how her daddy loved it with a pure but foolish heart, the way some fellas love a trade they just ain't built for. She told him about her mother passing on, speaking with the flat tone of a yarn she'd spun in her own head until all the jagged edges wore smooth. And old Garrett, he just listened. He never nudged her along and rarely asked a question, but she soon figured out he wasn't ignoring her. That was his way. He chewed on a story, slowly soaking it in, instead of just firing words back right away. Sometimes he'd bring up something she'd mentioned days prior, proving he'd been mulling it over. "You said your mama taught you to sew," he muttered one evening out of nowhere, working some stiff rawhide into a trap trigger. "I did." "How old were you when she started?" 5, I reckon, maybe 4. First useful skill she ever passed down. She paused for a moment, letting the memory return. She always claimed the difference between a real seamstress and someone just poking holes is whether she respects what the fabric actually wants to do, feeling the grain and the natural way it pulls tight in one direction. You've got to ride with it instead of fighting it. Garrett just sat quietly for a beat. "That's how trapping works," he muttered. "You figure out what the critter wants to do where it naturally wants to roam. Then you drop the steel right there." She looked at him. "I never really thought about it quite like that. Most things work out exactly the same when you really boil them down." It wasn't some grand cowboy philosophy, but it was a mighty long speech for him. She found herself chewing on those words long into the quiet evening. "Now, friend, you and I know the stories we tell, and the secrets we keep ain't always the same thing." She gave him the hard facts of her abandonment, that lonely clearing the dusty wagon ruts, and the cold arithmetic of what her kin decided she was worth, simply because she'd already laid out the bare bones of. That tragic tale on their first night together, and dodging it now, would just feel mighty strange. But what she kept locked away was the dark, bleeding heart of it. That gut-punch feeling of standing all alone in the dirt and realizing, right down to her very soul, that the folks who were supposed to be her bedrock had just packed up and vanished like smoke. That bitter truth was far harder to say. Not out of any shame, but because she doubted mere words could ever carry the true weight of it. She'd rather hold her tongue than speak poorly on a hurt so sharp. And old Garrett never dealt out his own tragedy to match. The 11 long years, the jagged scar, the real reason for it all. "Pull up a chair, partner." The man kept his secrets behind a heavy wall, and she respected that fence line. But he heard her out with a steady grit she'd grown to trust, and sometimes that was enough. Out here, that was more than she'd ever found before. When Garrett missed his regular morning return, she didn't panic right out the gate. She knew them traplines were mighty unpredictable. Sometimes he'd return by high noon. Other times, the sun sank clear away before his boots thumped that porch. She stoked that hearth. Finished baking her skillet cornbread, tossed Grim his grub, and just waited. The sky had been brewing up pure trouble since dawn. She'd peeked through the oilcloth window a couple times to study it right. It carried a nasty shade she'd learned to rightfully fear, a heavy, mean iron gray. Not your standard rain clouds, mind you, but a dark veil dragging a whole lot of weight behind it. That wind kept howling stronger since midday, blowing down off the northwest, which Garrett always warned birthed the meanest blizzards. Come late afternoon, she stood watching the timberline, quietly doing the awful math. Once the daylight truly bled out, that furious storm came roaring in. Gale winds slammed the cabin, making old timbers groan, while driving the white snow sideways, blinding the window with driving white fury. The bitter chill dropped so fast she felt it right indoors. Frost bit through the log chinking, creeping under the front door like a trespassing ghost, making that hearth fire struggle hard. Grim guarded the door. That hound held his post for a solid hour, something he only did when waiting on Garrett. Hazel stoked the flames, fighting off thoughts of how long any fella could survive a wicked gale like that. She pushed away the grim truth that she had zero clue where his traps laid. She fought the ugly notion that if the wild claimed Garrett out there in the timber, her own survival options suddenly got mighty short and downright grim. She anchored herself to chores. The hearth needed lumber. That porch woodpile had to come inside before the freezing cold sealed that front door shut for good. And that cornbread needed sliding off the hot iron stove before it burned up completely. She tackled every chore with the steady grit of a woman, staying busy just to keep raw panic off her porch. 2 hours past sundown, Grim snapped his head up. Hazel bolted upright before she even thought to move. She caught it, a heartbeat behind the hound, a strange noise that didn't belong to the howling blizzard. You and I both know an odd rhythm in the howling wind means a struggling human's out there. She snatched up his old heavy winter duster, swallowing her whole, but mighty. Worm shoved her arms in and threw the door open. The frost slammed her like a runaway train. That gale was legendary. The vicious kind that steals your breath right out your throat. She gripped the timber frame, squinting into the pitch black and driving snow, and for a terrifying second saw absolutely nothing. Then a dark shadow materialized at the porch steps. He was moving, which was a true blessing. Mostly standing, which was blessing number 2. But he was staggering mighty wrong, leaning hard, dragging a dead leg that wouldn't follow orders. When the gale broke for just a second, she saw his rugged face was twisted wrong, drawn tight with an agony way past simple winter chill. Garrett. She rushed those icy wooden steps without a thought catching his arm. He felt like dead weight, leaning almost nothing on his busted right side. What happened? Get inside, he rasped, voice steady. Can you walk? I'm walking. Technically he was. She slung his thick arm over her shoulders, hauling him up the icy steps. He gripped the rail while she shouldered every ounce of his massive weight she could possibly manage, which still wasn't near enough to spare him and her straining hip. Screamed a fierce protest she'd just filed away for tomorrow. They breached the threshold, and she kicked that heavy timber door shut. The golden lantern light struck blind after fighting that bitter black storm. She finally got a solid look at the man. Below the knee, his right pant leg ran mighty dark. Not snow-wet, but blood dark. Sit down, she demanded. It ain't sit down, Garrett. Something harsh in her tone, a command she had never drawn on before, forced the stubborn man into the chair. He eased down so carefully it proved just how wrecked that leg truly was. A hardened fellow like Garrett, Stone never moved gentle without damn good cause. She crouched down, getting hands on those heavy trousers as he mumbled, "Ain't as bad as it looks." She just looked up at him. I'll decide that myself, she said. He stayed dead quiet. She tried rolling up his pant leg. That heavy wool was frozen stiff. Blood had soaked right through and turned rock hard in the cold. Drawing her blade, she just sliced the fabric open instead. Faster that way. She peeled it back and stared at the mess underneath. Now you and I know the wilderness ain't kind. It looked terrible, and it was. A jagged, broken branch, the kind falling snow snaps off without any warning, had ripped right through the meat of his lower leg. Outer side about 5 inches over the ankle. An ugly, ragged gash, maybe 4 inches long and awful deep. Shallow near the edges, where rough bark scraped, but mighty deep in the middle where it punctured. Man had bled a whole lot. Still bleeding, too. Slow, steady seeping rather than pumping, meaning no main artery got struck in the chaos. But between the long bleed and that bitter frost, the blood hadn't clotted right. It just froze in thick, ugly layers over the torn skin. She stared at that leg, calculating exactly what supplies she had and the grim work ahead. "When did this happen?" she asked. 2 hours back, maybe more. "You walked on this for 2 hours?" Didn't have a choice. She looked right up at him. His expression was dead calm, which meant it was costing him the mountain of grit to fake it. She saw that pale strain around his lips, the kind folks get, bearing downright ungodly pain. "Gotta clean it," she told him. "And sew it shut." "I know. Need the whiskey. Shelf over the door behind the—" "I'll fetch it." She stood up. "Don't move." That whiskey sat exactly where he figured. Good fortune smiled. The heavy glass bottle was still more than half full. She dug out her needle and some heavy thread, way thicker than what she used for standard mending. Tough thread, meant for stitching canvas. She put water on the iron stove to boil, then tore a couple of clean rags into long strips, carrying her makeshift frontier medicine kit back to him. She dragged a chair right opposite his, sitting down to study that ruin again. If you've ever seen a real wound up close, you know the feeling. Her stomach turned, but she swallowed it down. "This is gonna hurt," she told him, echoing what he told her out in the deep snow when he picked her up. Now she truly understood why. "A whole lot." "I know that too. Do you want something tough to bite on?" He gave her a look a little bit insulted, mostly something fierce she couldn't quite put a name to. "Fine," she said. "Grip the chair." She scrubbed that injury first, poured raw whiskey right into the gash, and he made a sound that was barely a breath, mostly swallowed. But under her hands she felt every muscle in his strong leg lock tight as iron. She just bore down harder. Out here, stopping halfway does more harm than pushing through fast. "Talk," he hissed through gritted teeth. She looked up. "What?" "Talk to me. Say anything." She held a rag to the bleeding flesh, putting her weight into it, and just started talking without thinking. Something rambling about cornbread, how she'd been stretching out their meager cornmeal, wondering if the supplies would last the winter, and how adding the right fat changed the way it baked up. Kept her tone steady as a poker player, spinning a yarn while her bloodied hands did the brutal work required. All the while, he just gripped that wooden chair back with both hands, breathing heavy. Once she got the dirt and gore cleared out, she checked the torn skin. Those ragged edges were begging to split wide open. That gash was so deep, any walking at all would tear it right back open if she didn't stitch it up tight. Now she'd only done wilderness suturing twice. Once on a hound, back when she was 16, and once on her own palm after a knife slipped slicing rope. You and I can imagine the awful feeling of driving a needle through living skin, but she did it because out here the alternative was death. "I got to stitch it," she said. "I figured. I've sewn flesh before. Not a hole this massive, mind you, but I know the ropes." He stared at her. In the flickering firelight, the man's face looked mighty complicated. Not scared, she reckoned Garrett Stone didn't have much fear left in his bones. But he looked strangely vulnerable, unlike any way she'd seen him, like the sheer agony had finally knocked down his usual iron walls. "I believe you," he said. She sure wasn't expecting that trust. She almost asked him to repeat it, but instead threaded the heavy needle and started. She worked steady and slow, just like her ma taught her to sew tough leather, refusing to look too far ahead, just focused on the next stitch, then the next. She yanked those ragged edges together as neat as a nasty wilderness wound would ever allow. Picture it. No sound, just heavy breathing. She felt each breath through the faint, steady rise and fall of his leg beneath her hands. Now and then his grip would crush that chair back until the timber groaned. She'd feel those leg muscles knot up like rawhide under her fingers. Pause for a heartbeat, then keep right on working. That hound Grim pressed hard against Garrett's good leg. He leaned in with the dead reckoning steadiness of a dog who knew trouble had come calling and decided exactly how to handle it. 12 bloody stitches. She tied off the final knot, leaned back, and took a hard look at her handiwork. It sure wasn't pretty. The edges lined up, fair thread pulled tight, and spacing held fine. But she was no frontier doctor, that's certain. It was bound to leave an ugly scar, though. A gash like that always does. And that scar would sit right above a knee that had already seen its fair share of ruin. "It's finished," she said. He stared down at his leg, drew a long, ragged breath through his nose, and let it out slow. "Much obliged," he grunted. His voice carried a different weight. Not exactly softer, but stripped down, like real bone-deep truth coming up for air. She bound the leg up tight in fresh strips of linen, snug enough to stop the bleeding, but not so tight it'd choke off the blood. She finally stood, her own legs trembling like a newborn calf, a weakness she hadn't allowed herself to feel until the danger passed. She braced, a hand against the rough wood table, catching her breath. "You need to lay down in that cot," she told him. "I'll do right fine in this chair. That chair ain't for sleeping with a torn-up leg like yours. You need to lie flat and stay warm." She leveled a stern gaze on him. "Do not argue with me." A flicker of pure amusement danced across his face, barely shining through the thick grit of exhaustion and fresh agony. "You are different," he murmured. "Different from what?" "From when I dragged you in." She gathered up the blood-soaked rags, that half-empty whiskey bottle, and her mending needle. "You found me practically frozen to death. Anyone would act different after that." "That is not what I mean." She paused, meeting his gaze. He was studying her with a sharp, heavy look she had never seen from any man before, dead center sizing her up, and far more anchored than his usual quiet self. "You were scared back then," he said. "Not anymore." She chewed on that. "I just don't have the luxury to be scared right now." "No," he told her. "That is not quite it either." She stood there speechless, unsure how to answer. She set her supplies up on the shelf, stepped right back, draped his heavy arm over her shoulders, and hauled him toward the cot. He felt like dead weight now, with that ruined leg completely useless underneath him. She had to wedge her own hip beneath him as a brace, letting her muscles scream in protest. They managed to drop him onto that mattress with a sloppy, clumsy grit that got the job done without hitting the floorboards. She buried him under 2 heavy wolf pelts, then tossed a slim piece of kindling on the fire so the embers would last till dawn without cooking them alive. She dragged that spare wooden chair right up to the edge of the cot and took a seat. "I'll sit up a spell," she told him, "case the fever hits." "You don't need to." "Garrett." She fired his name back like a warning shot. "Let me." He just stared up at the dark rafters, his jaw clamped shut, a hard muscle jumping, and she could see him wrestling a demon that wasn't exactly physical pain, but sat mighty close to it. "You and I know it's bitter for a solitary man to admit he can't survive alone tonight." "Fair enough," he grumbled. She settled back into her chair while the hearth fire cracked. Outside, that merciless blizzard slammed against the timber walls with a howling, endless kind of fury. The oilcloth windows buckled inward with every freezing gust, and out in the pines, a heavy branch snapped with a crack that echoed right inside her chest. Inside, the fire held strong. Garrett's breathing leveled out as pure exhaustion drowned his agony, and Grim hopped onto the cot. She had never seen that hound do such a thing. She reckoned Garrett had strict rules against it, rules that were currently being tossed out by the hard circumstances, as the dog curled heavy at his boots, intending to stay right there. Hazel sat quietly in that rough chair, watching the flames dance, chewing on the words Garrett had spoken. "You were scared before, not anymore." Truth is, she hadn't noticed it herself until he called it out. Let me tell you, she tried to picture that helpless, trembling woman out in the snowdrifts, and the memory was crystal clear. She remembered the biting frost, the heavy despair, and just how mighty small she felt against the frontier. But that terrified girl felt 1,000 miles away now. More like a ghost story she had heard around a campfire than her own life. What changed? The frontier danger sure hadn't faded one bit. Let me tell you folks, the ugly gash on Garrett's leg spoke volumes about frontier danger. It wasn't that she'd grown sheer physical muscle, though her hands were surely calloused now, and her arms held a newfound grit they never carried before coming out here. It was a different fire. It came down to being downright useful when it truly mattered. Providing those hard-earned meals that kept their bellies full against the biting cold. Mending the heavy coats that warded off the winter chill, sewing up a man's leg with stitches she prayed would hold. Being needed ain't quite the same as being loved out here, and she finally knew the difference after a lifetime of tangling those two things up. But it meant something solid. It was a kind of worth that didn't rely on folks' approval or their fickle choice to keep you around. You stake your own claim. You become the sole reason you are still drawing breath. That was the big shift. The fire burned low, so she carefully stoked it with one last small chunk of firewood. Garrett was breathing deep and steady now. His pale color had improved since he first stumbled through that cabin door. If a fever was brewing, it hadn't struck just yet. She pulled her heavy coat tighter and settled into her chair. It was a long, howling night of a storm, and she kept her eyes open through nearly all of it. But she stayed awake like a guard standing watch, not like some greenhorn terrified of the pitch-black darkness. That's a mighty important difference to learn out west. She held her post until the first pale dawn light crept through the oilcloth window. Then she rose boiled water on the cast-iron stove, checked that nasty wound, and found her stitching had held strong through the long night. She let out a long breath and allowed herself to carefully hope, without any premature celebrating, that maybe they'd both pull through. You and I know the frontier, though. The fever struck day 2. She'd been waiting. She checked his brow constantly, like a pioneer woman testing bread dough, pressing the back of her hand to his skin to read his temperature. That first morning following the accident, he felt mostly normal, making her think they'd caught a lucky break. But by evening 2, his skin turned dangerously dry and burning hot. Deep in the night, he was sweating clean through those heavy animal furs, and his breathing shifted from a peaceful, steady rhythm into a shallow, ragged struggle for every single drop of air. She tirelessly applied cold rags to his brow, rinsing cloth in a tin basin of water, wringing it hard and pressing it back down. It was grueling, tedious work, and likely only did a fraction of good, but she did it anyway because it was all she had. She swapped his leg bandage, noting the wound looked exactly as expected. Mighty angry and swollen, sure, but without those deadly red streaks or foul odors that signal the rot of a deep infection. That was a huge relief. The most crucial relief. But Garrett was a miserable patient. Not that she expected otherwise. During that first feverish day, he stayed completely knocked out, sleeping hard, occasionally drifting up into a hazy fog that wasn't exactly waking up, mumbling broken fragments of thought she couldn't string together. She heard a name once, maybe 2, but couldn't quite catch them. Whispers about some river, something lost to the wind. She never tried answering him, just kept swapping that cold rag, feeding the crackling fire, and resting his leg on a folded animal pelt. Come the second fever day, he woke up more, which was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because the fever wasn't dragging him down completely. A curse because a half-awake Garrett Stone is still stubbornly Garrett Stone, and that man absolutely despised lying flat and taking help. "I need to check the north line," he grumbled, his first clear words that morning while she stood by the stove. She turned and stared him down. "No." "There's a beaver trapped up there." "Garrett, you have a gaping leg hole I sewed shut 40 hours ago. You're burning with fever. You aren't going anywhere." He glared at the ceiling like an outlaw silently plotting out his next escape attempt. "Those traps need running," he argued. "The traps will keep. The animals won't. If an animal sits too long in this bitter cold, then it just sits." She brought a tin cup of water to his cot. "Drink this." He just stared at the metal cup. Then he stared at her. He drank it with the spite of a stubborn man wanting you and me to know he was protesting. "You're stubborn," he muttered. "Learned it from someone," she fired back. "Pull up a chair." He stayed quiet. She reckoned he nearly smiled. The fever broke on day 3, just like fevers do. It broke hard and messy. A long night of heavy sweating soaked their winter gear, leaving him pale and flat-out emptied by sunrise. But he had clear eyes for the very first time since that falling timber laid him low. She changed out his bloody bandages and boiled down the last dried venison into a thin, sad broth. He swallowed down every single drop. "How much meat we got left to chew on?" he asked. Wasn't really a question. She'd been bracing for this exact frontier reckoning. "Not much." "How much?" "Enough for maybe 10 days if I ration it out." "Less if this bitter cold holds on, and we gotta eat extra just to survive." He fell quiet, chewing on the same grim survival math she had already done. His face showed that slow, steady calculating he always did. "I gotta check those trap lines," he muttered. "Your leg." "I know exactly what my leg is." "How long until I can put my boots on it?" She stared at the nasty wound, thinking honestly. "A full 2 weeks before you ought to put any real weight down. 10 days minimum before stepping past this cabin door. We don't have 2 weeks of winter rations. I know that." Their eyes locked together. "I can head out," she told him. "Just to the woodpile, out to the porch. I've been handling that fine." "Those wilderness trap lines ain't the porch. You don't know the trail, and you can't check a rig without—" "I know I can't run your hunting lines." She kept her tone steady. "I am not claiming that. I am just trying to figure out what tools we actually got left." Another heavy silence fell. Now this was a trait she had come to learn about the man. That quiet wasn't empty. He was thinking hard, and breaking it would only backfire. "There is a rabbit snare rigged," he finally grunted, 50 yards northeast, in the hollow between those 2 giant spruces. "Mighty simple trigger mechanism. You could reset it easy. Snowshoe hares run that hollow regular." "Point me that way." From the porch you can spot the taller spruce when the winter snow ain't falling too thick. The gully runs right along the base of that timber. "All right then. Oh, and there's dried fish in a tin under that second flat shelf. Slipped my mind. Ain't much, but it's something to chew." She hurried over and dug out that tin. Inside lay 6 slabs of dried fish, tough as saddle leather and smelling fierce. Hardly a feast, but she bumped her survival math up by 4 or 5 days. She felt the heavy relief deep in her bones. "That surely helps," she muttered. He let out a long, ragged breath. "Hazel." She looked back at him. He used her name so rarely, it always hit hard whenever he actually said it. "I ain't gonna tell you how to survive if the worst takes me," he rasped. "You already know what needs doing. Nothing bad is taking you yet." "That ain't— I know what you are getting at." She slammed that tin down onto the table. "And I am flat out refusing to have that grim talk today. Today your blasted fever just broke and you need to eat up and rest. I am hiking out to check that hollow's snare, and we are going to face whatever is actually standing right in front of us today, instead of fretting over the darkest trails that might lie ahead." He studied her face for a good long spell. "Fine," he grumbled. Good. She hiked out to that snare that afternoon, walking during a lull in the blizzard when she could see the trail. She found the hollow he mentioned and the trap exactly where he claimed, empty but untouched, the trigger sitting perfect. She set it tighter, just like he had showed her with some spare rope a few weeks back. They had been swapping idle talk, and he just rigged it up without turning it into a preachy lesson. She found and reset 2 more hidden traps nearby. She had nearly walked past them, buried out there under the fresh winter powder. She hiked back into the cabin, bone cold, completely worn out with empty hands. He was awake on his cot, staring as she walked through the door, wearing the exact same desperate question on his face that she carried on hers. "Turned up empty," she sighed. "But I rigged them tight. Maybe tomorrow." He nodded. He kept quiet about her wandering that harsh, snowy terrain alone on a bum hip. Truth be told, she had fully expected this stubborn old fool to scold her. "Now look here, folks." Somewhere deep in that fever haze, the man finally accepted that his survival completely depended on Hazel's grit. She couldn't rightly say when that change happened. It surely wasn't one single solitary moment. "Let's gather round for this one, you and I." Trouble piled up like quiet snow until they were buried. That snare sat dead empty 3 whole days. She checked it at sunup, making it part of her daily chores. But every morning she walked back empty-handed, recalculating their dwindling grub supply in her head. She kept that harsh math strictly to herself. Out on the frontier ain't no use in worrying. It just eats a person alive from the inside out. Garrett was mending. Or mending as much as a stubborn mule like him allowed. By day 4 after the fever broke, he was upright, pacing that cabin, despite all her fierce warnings to stay put. That busted leg carried his weight with what looked like pure agony, but it held up. And that deep wound was closing up right whenever she changed the bandages. The edges were stitching together tight, proving her needlework had held strong. "It's going to leave a mighty bad scar," she told him on her 6th time changing those rags. "I got others." She'd surely noticed them, but she kept quiet. "The stitching is good," he muttered, stared right at the rafters, not her. Speaking like a man, just reading the weather off a farmer's almanac. "It does the job," she answered. "Ain't pretty. Don't need to be." She tied off the cloth and sat back. "How's it hurting?" "Manageable." Which meant it hurt like hell. She knew his stoic ways. "I'm checking the snare," she stated. "I'm coming." She stared him down. "Garrett, I know this wild country way better. If we gotta move the trap, I spot the game trails faster." She wanted to fight him on it, but the man was dead right. Makes arguing mighty tough. "You take the walking staff," she told him, pointing to that heavy branch she'd whittled smooth while he laid up sick. Half walking stick, half crutch. "Fine by me." They stepped out into the freeze. First time she'd walked outside with that man since the dark night he stumbled through her door bleeding out. The chill was bone deep, a wicked kind of frost that put ordinary winter weather to shame. It had a rough bite, a heavy, downright physical presence. The snow sat deep, crusted over by a tricky freeze and thaw. The slick surface looked tough enough to hold a body's weight, but it gave way and busted through half the time. Garrett limped slow but mighty steady, letting that wooden staff bear the heavy load. She kept to his slow rhythm, easing her own stride. Her bad hip preferred flat ground, and this jagged, crusted ice field was anything but smooth riding. The hollow was dead empty again. She watched him hunker down, favoring that bum leg, studying the powder around the snare like a scholar reading a heavy book. Instead of a man just glancing at the dirt, he pressed the snow twice, checked the trap's trigger, and swept his eyes across the timber. "Shift it," he grunted. 10 feet north. Game trail right here." He pointed. She stared hard but saw absolute nothing. "You can see they've been tracking right by that fallen timber. The trap's sitting in the wrong spot altogether. I never spotted the trail. It's mighty faint. Snow is barely scuffed up. Critters are moving dead of night." He stood up, real slow. "Set it yonder." Keep that trigger on a hair." She rigged it under his steady gaze. He kept quiet, which, in his silent way, meant she did good work. "Now pay attention. You and I know this quiet never lasts." Grim the hound was scouting ahead when he froze up solid. That dog locked up stiff. Wasn't his usual curious pose when he caught wind of a rabbit. No, this was the rigid stillness of a hound staring down deadly trouble. His head held high, eyes burning into the western pines. Then, a deep, dark rumble started in his chest. A warning sound she had never once heard out of him. She stopped cold. Garrett, too. "How far behind is our rifle?" he whispered. Leaving that gun on the porch suddenly felt like a damn fool mistake. 60 yards, she answered back in the same hushed breath. They heard the pack before they saw hide or hair. Sounded like wild hounds, but twisted. A mess of sharp, high yips drifting through the timber. They were circling in from all sides. Grim's snarl turned savage. "Walk backward," Garrett ordered. "No running." "I know." They pivoted, stepping steady. Not fast, not dragging. The calm march of folks who know running means dying, especially when safety ain't nearly close enough to reach on a sprint. She heard Garrett's heavy breathing shift, that ruined leg taking a worse toll on the retreat than the hike out. She sidled up closer to his left flank, subtle-like, making no big fuss about it. Then she spotted the first beast at the brush. Gray and starving skinny. The kind of hunger that makes a creature bold. Not your healthy frontier timberwolf. What do you and I reckon it stared with cold patience, stalking them long before they ever knew they were the prey? Gather round, friends. She spotted 3 more out there, likely others hiding in the brush. "Grim," Garrett said, his voice low and flat. That hound moved right to his boot. Smart dog, she figured. Any trapper knows a lone cur can't win that scrap. The cabin porch stood 30 yards out. 20. Those timber wolves hit the tree line and froze a truly unsettling sight. Meant those predators were close enough to consider a strike. 15 yards. The alpha stepped up. Not a dead run, just testing the waters, circling toward Garrett's right flank, where his busted leg made him look like easy prey. She caught the move, wheeled around, and let out a holler. No words, just raw noise, loud, sharp, carrying all the prairie fire she could muster. That wolf halted, mighty spooked, and backed off. 10 yards to the porch. She beat them there, snatching the rifle off the wall and aiming out the door in under 10 seconds flat, and Garrett hobbled inside with Grim right on his heels. She threw her weight against the heavy timber door, slamming it shut. For a quick second, neither moved an inch. Her chest was absolutely pounding. She noticed it like a rancher watches a coming storm, just a force of nature hitting her territory that she couldn't do a thing to stop. "You shouted at it," Garrett said. "It worked." "It worked," he agreed. He gave her a steady gaze. What she had learned was a grizzled frontiersman's quiet brand of respect, which wasn't loud or flashy, but you'd spot it dead on if you knew the signs. She was already at the glass, peeling back a corner of oiled cloth. The pack lingered right on, the tree line barely visible in that bleak gray dusk. 5 of them. She checked twice. Exactly 5. Every single one looked gaunt and bony. Desperate scavengers surviving a bitter wilderness winter with barely a scrap of meat to feed on. "They'll come back," she muttered. "Yes, tonight probably. Or they'll wait and watch." "Yes." He limped over to her side by the frost-covered glass, staring outside. "They've probably been following the cabin smell for days. We've been burning the bones and scraps in the stove, but this cold carries scent differently." She chewed on that grim fact. She pictured their rabbit snare down the gully and just how far it was. Trekking out there come morning was a real fool's errand, now that a starving wolf pack had basically marked them as the main course. "We have to solve 2 problems, she declared. "The wolves and the food. If we solve one, We solve both." He murmured it softly, his eyes locked on that snowy clearing. She caught his drift instantly. She eyed those wolves in the timber, weighing the meat on their bones, tasting the ugly reality of wilderness survival. "Can you shoot left-handed?" she asked. "Now let's think on this together." His right leg was wounded, but she rightly worried if a compromised shooting stance could hold completely steady. "I can shoot. It won't be my best shooting." "It doesn't need to be your best. It needs to hit the lead animal." She shot him a hard look. "The others will break if the leader goes down. Pack logic." He stared right back. "You know about wolves?" "I know about groups," she told him. "It's not so different." The trapper stayed quiet, mulling it over, in the morning first light, when they're most likely to push better visibility. "All right." She dropped that heavy oilcloth back down. Suddenly that little log cabin felt mighty cramped around the two of them. Just 2 feet of space between them, both standing firm by the glass, bathed in the low glow of the hearth. The winter chill rolled right off his heavy coat from their brush with death. "I'm sorry," he muttered softly. She shot him a glance. "For what?" "For going down, for putting us in this situation." He said it straight out, no soft edges. But there was a heavy shame buried in his voice that clearly cost the man dearly. "You didn't plan to get hit by a falling timber." "I should have been watching better." She turned his way. "Garrett, you carried me out of a raging blizzard." "You fed me, kept me breathing, and never asked for a dime. You don't get to apologize for getting hurt." He held her gaze firmly. The campfire shadows danced across his rugged face, revealing a bone-deep exhaustion and the searing pain from his injury. "You and I know proud men," he carried the awkward burden of a lone wolf who just couldn't handle owing somebody his life. "You stitched me back together," he rasped. "Yes." "You sat up all night, for 3 nights." "Yes." "Why?" Now that question was dead genuine. Out here on the frontier, that made it the strangest thing she'd heard in ages. She chewed on it, giving it real heavy thought. "Because you are still breathing," she told him, "and I aim to keep you that way." He stayed quiet. She just turned back to the iron stove, threw on more water, and acted like that boiling pot was the only thing in the whole world. Dawn broke gray and dead quiet, that heavy mountain stillness that always comes right before trouble. She was already up. Truth is, she tossed all night, and when that pale sun finally bled through the window cloth, she peeled back the corner. There stood the alpha wolf in the clearing, standing alone while his pack waited like shadows back in the timber. He stared right at that timber cabin with the cold, measuring look of a predator whose mind was made up. Garrett was up too, quiet as a ghost. He took that rifle from her hands, checking the action with the smooth, lightning speed of a man who knows his iron. He stepped up to the glass. "Crack it," he whispered. "Just 2 inches." She cracked the cover 2 inches. Bitter mountain air rushed in, silencing a jay in the pines. The big wolf snapped his head right up. Garrett braced the heavy barrel against the wooden sill. Now you could see he kept his weight completely off that bad right leg, leaning hard on the left, shifting his whole stance to make up for the busted limb. His breathing went dead calm. She stopped breathing entirely. That gunshot shattered the morning quiet. One massive crack bouncing off the pines like rolling thunder. The alpha dropped right in the snow. The rest of the pack scattered fast, vanishing into the deep timber with terrifying speed. Poof, just gone. Left the yard totally empty, just that gray heap bleeding out, while the echo died in the lonely high country. She finally let her breath out. Garrett dropped the gun. He just stared out the crack, wearing a look she could not figure out. It was not pride. Something a whole lot heavier. "Clean shot," she told him. "It was close range, but it was clean." He gave her a hard, sidelong glance. Then his eyes drifted back to the dead beast, and suddenly she understood the heavy look on his face. because it hit her too. That heavy, dark guilt of taking a life just to survive. A frontier trade that never feels right. "I will head out first," he mumbled. "We go together," she fired back, like always. He locked eyes with her and just swallowed whatever stubborn argument he had brewing. Side by side, they marched into the freezing dawn, pulling that heavy carcass back to safety. It was a brutal, clumsy haul. They kept their mouths shut. Her bad hip was screaming in agony. His bum leg was hollering too, though he just clenched his jaw tight and breathed slow and steady. But they got it done. By nightfall, she roasted what meat they could eat, leaving the rest on the freezing porch. Out here, winter is better than any icebox you can buy. That wild meat was stringy, gamey, and tough as leather, but they chewed it down silently. It was the only thing keeping them from starving out. Besides, they were way past caring if their dinner tasted any good. She sat on one side of the wood table, him on the other. The dog sat between them, catching scraps they both secretly slipped him. Neither of them said a word about it either. Outside the ridge stayed dead quiet. The pack never showed their faces for the next 2 nights. A snare trapped 2 fat hares next week, and by day 10, Garrett was hobbling out to check the close trap lines again, limping slow and staying close to camp, but hauling in just enough fresh meat. The bleeding edge of danger passed, but the winter. If you know these mountains, you know winter still had brutal weeks left to burn. Rations stayed tight, and that bum leg needed watching way longer than a stubborn man like Garrett would ever admit. Still, that immediate deadly scare was over now. What grew in its place was entirely new for both of those rugged folks. She couldn't rightly put it into words, only knew that watching him by the firelight on those long nights, a quiet peace had settled between them out of nowhere. Not soft, mind you, because frontier folks ain't built soft. Just solid. Like heavy leather stitching, ugly, but it holds under pressure. Took staring down starvation to see the bond they forged. But it was there, and it was holding fast. Spring out here never shows up the way city folks reckon it does. You don't just wake up to birds singing and the hills glowing green and sweet. The wild makes you earn it. Let me tell you, spring out here arrives pickin' fights. A warm afternoon, then deep freeze. A week of thaw turning drifts into mud, followed by a sudden overnight frost freezing that slush solid, turning those cabin porch steps into an absolute death trap. You'd hear it first, water, rushing deep beneath the heavy snowpack long before you saw it. It showed up in how the daylight shifted, real quiet-like at first. Just a certain weight to that late sun, entirely different from January's pale, watery gray skies, something holding real purpose. Hazel spotted the shift in Grim first. That hound started lingering by the heavy timber door much more often, not guarding like he did through the bitterest blizzards, but carrying a restless itch that looked outward toward the wild, not inside. That dog yearned to roam. He craved a world beyond the cabin's yard, and that strict boundary Garrett kept him inside during the harshest storms. Honestly, Hazel deeply understood that exact same itch. Garrett's leg mended fair enough, which means it healed rough and crooked, just like all wounds do out here in the unforgiving backcountry, leaving a thick scar that ached whenever storms rolled in, causing morning stiffness. Garrett walked off instead of ever whining about it, pacing the porch planks back and forth until those muscles loosened. He never spoke on it, and she never pried. By now those two spoke the language of each other's silences, rendering most chatter totally useless anyway. Hard labor filled those late winter and early spring days. Chores that weren't just about surviving the day. We're talking longer horizons out here. Future planning. Garrett started the gritty work of prepping his spring pelts for trade. Meanwhile, she took over his tally sheets, such as they were, hidden inside a beat-up ledger stashed way up high on the top shelf. His scribbles got the job done, but lacked any order. It was the shorthand of a solitary trapper keeping track for himself, never figuring another living soul would ever try reading it. Unprompted, she sorted it out, walking him through the new setup once. He just eyed it and muttered, "That's better." Then he went back to his skins. That concluded the entire discussion. When afternoons stretched longer, she took to doing a real hard inventory of that homestead. You and I know frontier survival. But this wasn't frantic rationing anymore. This was a true, long-term sizing up of what the place needed to thrive in the future. The mud chinking between the north wall timber was crumbling fast, demanding patching before snowfall returned. That second wooden porch step had been rotting long before she showed up, practically turning into a broken neck waiting for spring mud. Their timber stack sat too low to see them safely through another year, meaning spring chopping had to kick off mighty early. She scratched these notes straight into the margins of scrap paper tucked inside that ledger. She kept it hid from Garrett. She figured it was just instinct taking over, the grit of a woman who conquered chaotic situations by wrapping her mind completely around them. She didn't dare look into that too closely. But that reckoning she'd dodged all winter long finally caught up to her come March, right as heavy thaw stripped the snow back and exposed the rugged frontier again. The hidden river she'd only heard beneath the ice finally showed its face, starting as black puddles near the frost, before bursting into a wild, roaring creek choked with freezing mountain snowmelt. Those towering peaks above the timberline finally revealed themselves. She knew they loomed out there, but now they stood stark and massive, painted bright white against skies that finally shined a genuine blue. Soon that mountain pass would clear, maybe weeks off still, but it would happen. Once it did, she had a sworn deal to uphold. Come spring, you ride out. She never forgot that rule. She'd just buried the thought in a dark corner of her brain, same way folks lock the cellar door when they don't want to face what's hiding down in it. Yet March dragged the truth right back out into the light, steady as the thawing creek and the jagged peaks. Hard facts that never left, just buried under the snow. She woke before dawn one late March morning. With the hearth fire roaring, she sat at the rough wood table, clutching a hot mug of coffee. Genuine, real coffee, which Garrett had dug from a hidden tin she never knew existed, offering it up with a look about as close to friendly mischief as that hardened man could muster. She sat pondering fruitlessly on the trail ahead. She possessed no homestead to ride back to, no kin left alive. Leastways none that mattered anymore. The girl held 0 coin, no land to her name, and absolutely nowhere to go. Let's face facts here. She crossed that pass with folks who discarded her, survived winter with a stranger who barely tolerated her, yet he somehow kept her breathing anyway. You and I know frontier spring well. She was supposed to just pick a direction and walk. She was wrestling with that thought when Garrett stepped inside from checking the morning trapline. The man was moving better than he had in months. That busted leg finally acting like a proper leg again. He poured himself some coffee at the stove, but instead of limping over to his favorite chair or that worn work table, he just stood there, back turned to her, staring at the iron for a long, heavy stretch. So she waited. "There's going to be a wagon train through," he finally mumbled to the wall above the stove. "Month and a half, maybe 2 months. They come through the lower pass in late May most years. I go down and trade the season's pelts. There's a trading post at the junction." "All right," she said. "You could join them." He shifted on his boots, not quite facing her, but not completely turned away anymore. "I have gold set aside from good years. You could take enough to get yourself set up somewhere. A town. Portland's grown considerably. Sacramento. Somewhere with more than this." She just stared at him. He was staring out into the middle distance, wearing that dead-neutral pioneer look, the one men use when the words they speak are costing them a piece of their soul. She realized right then he had been chewing on this for weeks. He had orchestrated this whole escape for her. The wagon route, the gold, the safe exit. It is what a man does when a woman's safety matters a whole lot more to him than his own lonely desires. "How much gold?" she asked. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Enough." "That's not an amount. Enough to start over comfortably." He finally turned to meet her eyes. "You deserve a better situation than this. A real house, a town people. She glanced down at her tin coffee cup. She pictured Portland. She pictured busy Sacramento streets. She imagined settlements with solid timber buildings, general stores, and folks who actually talked instead of grunting. She tried seeing herself in civilization, rolling into town with enough gold dust to be respectable, starting a fresh chapter. But that picture just didn't spark the way she expected. "You want me to go?" she asked. "I want." He stopped, then tried again. "What I want isn't the relevant question. It's one of them." He just stayed quiet. "You and I know this look." She set her cup down, locking eyes with him the only way he could handle, which was a whole lot bolder than most folks out west ever expected. "Garrett, do you want me to go?" The quiet that followed wasn't their usual chore silence. It was that third kind of cabin quiet. The evening stillness that felt more like a living, breathing spirit than emptiness. The silence dragged until a thick log cracked in the hearth, and the hound lifted his head off the floorboards before settling back down. "No," Garrett muttered. He said it the way a cowboy admits a painful truth, forcing the words out. "No. I don't want you to go, but what I want doesn't—" "Stop saying that." She rose slowly from that wooden table. Nothing dramatic, she just needed to stand tall for this. "I've spent my whole life around people who told me that what they needed mattered more than what I needed, and what I could offer, and who I was. My stepmother told my father that I was a liability, and my father, who I believed loved me, decided that was an arithmetic he could live with." Her voice never wavered. She had accepted that brutal history. Maybe not the sting of it, but she survived the facts. "I'm not doing that again. I'm not letting someone else decide what I'm worth and where I belong." He looked right at her. "So I'm asking you directly," she said. "Do you want me to stay?" Another silence hit the room, shorter now. "Yes," he said. "Then say so. Don't pack my bag and hand me gold and make the decision for me because you've decided you're not worth staying for." That hit him hard. She watched the truth strike home. Just a slight flinch around his tired eyes, a tiny shift in his rugged stance. We all know the truth cuts deep. She didn't mean to draw blood, but she spoke honest frontier truth, and she sure wasn't going to take it back. "It's not a small thing," he said, "staying here. It's a hard life. It doesn't get easier." "I know that. I've been living it for 4 months. A hard life gets harder when—" He stopped. "When what?" he said. "Let me tell you," he gave her a look she'd rarely seen. It was that look a man gets when he surfaces from his deep, quiet depths, only to stop cold because stepping any further meant crossing into rough country he couldn't easily navigate. That ugly neck scar, those 11 quiet years. All those hard secrets she never pried into. She just waited. "When you care if someone's all right," he mumbled. "It complicates things." She knew the heavy toll those words took on a man like him, and she surely didn't take them lightly. She just let that truth hang heavy in the quiet air between them. "I know," she whispered softly. "I know it does." The frontiersman just stared at her for a long, silent stretch. He turned his eyes toward the window, watching that genuine pale gold morning sun shining right through the old oilcloth. He glanced down at his calloused hands, then met her gaze. "That north wall chinking needs patching up," he muttered. She blinked. "I know it. Got it written down. The step, too. Second from the top." "Known about that since February. I was thinking," he drawled real slow, stepping careful like a scout crossing mighty strange terrain. "We might build another small room. That back wall is sturdy, and I can start cutting good timber come April." He took a breath. "More room might do us good." She just stared at this rugged man with his scarred neck and busted knee, a fellow with 11 years of chosen isolation, totally unable to just spit out the plain truth of what he was actually trying to say. A sudden warmth spread deep inside her chest. She didn't try fighting it or slapping a fancy name on it. She simply let it settle in. "It sure would," she agreed. "Ought to dig a proper root cellar before autumn, too. Our cold storage is holding up, but it isn't exactly ideal." "Got a good spot on the east side for it. The dirt there isn't overly rocky. I will add it to the tally." He just nodded, carried his black coffee over to the heavy table, and sat. She pulled up a chair across from him. They drank their brew in a deep quiet that wasn't exactly pure silence. Out here, it's never total silence. The running creek was loud. Spring birds were hitting the timber, and the hound shifted on the floorboards. But this quiet felt mighty peaceful. It was the kind of peace meant for two folks who barely survived a brutal hardship by leaning on each other, and who finally stopped pretending they hadn't. Stick with me here. 6 weeks later, wagons crossed the lower pass. Hazel stood out on the porch, watching those canvas-topped wagons snake through the sprawling valley below. Looking tiny from afar, they rolled mighty slow in the warm spring breeze. It was a sprawling, good-sized outfit, likely 20 heavy pioneer wagons in all, kicking up dry dust that proved the spring thaw was finally here to stay. Of course, she already knew those folks were heading this way. Last week, Garrett swapped stories with a ragged trapper down on the southern boundary. That old boy claimed the westbound train was only 2 days out. He'd ridden back and shared the trail news in his usual flat, plain-spoken style. Then he just returned to framing that new cabin edition, waiting on the roofing materials he needed from the trading post. She just stood, watching those dusty wagons roll. The hound sat close, resting his heavy head against her leg, like he had been doing since deep February. It always made her feel quietly respected by the beast. Her mind drifted to those wagons and the weary frontier folks riding inside them, where they were bound, and what Western dreams they were chasing down. She recalled herself just 4.5 months ago, shivering in a wagon crossing a treacherous mountain pass. Back then, she figured the folks driving were the true north, guiding her entire, lonely existence. She thought about her old man, a habit she'd slowly dropped as winter dragged on. It didn't hurt any less, mind you. She'd just learned to look at the cold, hard map of her reality without blinking. Her daddy loved her. She firmly believed that, and she knew his terrible choice took a mighty heavy toll on his soul during those long, freezing winter months alone. But deep love and tough choices don't always align, and he had made his. She'd been carving out a brand new life in the wreckage, much like a settler rebuilding a homestead after a violent flash flood. Salvaging whatever strong timber was left, putting it all together in a completely new way. She surely wasn't that same frightened girl fetching firewood last November. She'd felt the shift in tiny moments all winter long, and she felt it again watching those pioneer wagons. Looking back on it, that desperate woman in November had just been blindly waiting on some leader to point out her patch of dirt and tell her exactly what part she was supposed to play in their story. Waiting to mean something to folks on their own strict terms. But sometime between fighting off that hungry wolf and the spring thaw, she had quit waiting entirely. We've all seen how the trail changes folks. One morning, she just looked up and realized she wasn't waiting on nobody anymore. Gather round, friends. Picture Garrett stepping from the tree line, hauling heavy timber on one shoulder with that steady, familiar rolling gait of a man who spent decades learning how to let a heavy load work with his body instead of fighting it. He strolled up to the porch, dropped the wood, squared his shoulders, and followed Hazel's gaze down to the valley below. They stood together, watching those distant wagons crawl. "You ought to head down," she told him. "Trade our furs, grab that roofing tin, and whatever else we lack." "We are both going," he replied. "You need boots. Those won't survive another hard winter." She stared at her boots. Resoled twice already, they were barely held together by frayed rawhide and sheer, stubborn willpower. "I was fixing to bring that up." "I know. You hated adding to the list." She glanced his way. He kept his eyes locked on the wagons, but she caught a slight twitch at his mouth. "I'll add them now," she said. 2 days later, they hit the trail, taking the old mule down. Turns out, Garrett kept a stubborn mule stashed in a little lean-to shelter just a quarter-mile from their cabin. Just one of many frontier secrets she was still uncovering. They packed a sled tight with winter furs. Now listen, that trading post was small and jammed shoulder to shoulder with restless wagon pioneers, reeking of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and fresh pine. It was the loudest, most crowded spot she had seen since November. The chaos rattled her for 20 minutes, but then she found her prairie legs. She haggled the pelt prices herself. This shocked the shopkeeper, but Garrett didn't bat an eye, stepping back to let her work. She scored a richer payout than his first lowball bid, plus a fair deal on the boots she picked. Honestly, they were far better crafted than anyone expected out here. She praised his goods, and the merchant looked mighty proud to be known for quality instead of just convenience. She bought real, honest coffee. Sacks of cornmeal, flour, salt, and just enough sweet, dried fruit to make a difference. She picked up the roofing tin. Then, riding a sudden gut instinct, she bought a real pane of glass to replace that dirty window oilcloth. It cost dearly, burning through Garrett's budget limit, but she never looked back. As they packed up, a wagon train woman walked right over. Around 40 years old, wearing that trail-weathered look of a traveler who finally made peace with the endless, dusty road. "You folks aren't riding with our train," she stated, hardly a question. "No," Hazel said. "My home is up the mountain." The traveler watched Garrett stack lumber on the sled, moving with that steady, rhythmic, machine-like grace of a true frontiersman. She looked back. "Been here long?" "Since November." "Through the deadly winter." She paused. "All alone." "Never alone," Hazel answered. The pioneer squinted, giving her that sharp, sizing-up stare, clearly wondering about the dirty details and whether she ought to pry deeper. "It's hard country," the woman said. "It is." Hazel nodded. "It's also mine." She hadn't planned on saying it. It struck with quiet, iron certainty, a deep frontier truth she knew inside without even realizing she knew it. She stood with it for a moment, testing the weight. It was honest. The high peaks, the timber, the biting frost, that crisp alpine air, that icy creek, the warm cabin, the morning light glowing through the oilcloth, and very soon through real glass. It was all hers, in a way far deeper than a paper deed. You see, it was hers because she bled for it. She nearly died on that ridge, yet chose to plant her boots and stay. Out west, nothing truly belongs to you until you pay for it in blood and sweat. The stranger just nodded, grasping that silent truth, and drifted back to her wagon. Garrett materialized right at Hazel's shoulder. He heard that last part she figured, or near enough. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes." They secured the final load and aimed the old mule back toward the mountain. That climb back was grueling. Exhausted from the roaring trading post, she just let the deep fatigue wash over her bones without fighting back. Swaying to the heavy rhythm of the sled, she watched the valley fade away below as the dark timber swallowed the snowy trail again. The dying afternoon sun was working magic on the high ridges, painting the mountain snow in a fiery wash of pink and gold. It is the kind of breathtaking, pioneer sunset that only burns for 20 fleeting minutes in the dead of winter. Now she'd watched it all winter long. But keeping quiet becomes a habit when you've got nobody out here to tell it to. Now she finally spoke up. "The light on those peaks." Garrett took a good long look. "March is better," he told her. "Sometimes come March, if those clouds hang just right, it turns blood red." "Real red." "Real red. You'll see it." She just stared at him. Next March. He was casually talking about next year, see, without making a big fuss over it. You and I know that's how a man speaks to someone who's staying the winter, sharing the rugged calendar of the land with somebody who finally belongs to it. She looked straight ahead. "I want a garden," she declared, "on the cabin's south side." Afternoon sun hits perfect there. We could be pulling fresh vegetables by midsummer. Ground's mighty tough to bust up there. I know it. I'll start early, take it piece by piece. A quiet beat. I'll help. She nodded. You sure can. Their homestead peeked through the timber as daylight faded. That sturdy stone chimney showed up first, then those bare walls, and the unfinished framing just waiting on a good roof. The hound Grim waited up on the porch. He'd beaten them home by a mile, watching them walk up with yellow eyes and total indifference. She stepped off that sled. Her heavy new boots struck the dirt hard, and her crippled hip whispered complaints about the long trek. She just promised it a chair, soon standing tall to admire that rough cabin. It was small, crude, and needed way more fixing up than the long list she'd been keeping in her head. This wasn't the shelter of a man flush with help or extra time. No, it was built on nothing but pure, stubborn, frontier determination. One cold November morning, her own kin figured out she was a burden they wouldn't haul. They stared at her bad leg, weighed her against the wagon load, ran their cruel pioneer math, and simply decided she wasn't worth the trouble. But what those folks never reckoned on was who she'd become without them. Now, you and I ought to stop and realize something about being thrown out on the trail by the very blood that should protect you. Sometimes, when you are thrown into the absolute worst kind of Western hardship, with a decent man finally standing beside you, being abandoned is exactly what teaches you how much steel you've got inside. You learn you can stitch a bleeding gash in a man's leg with trembling hands and do it perfectly. That you can raise a rifle to a timber wolf on borrowed bravery and shoot straight. That you can carve a real life out of being completely unwanted if you just sweat for it. Being left behind doesn't brand your soul. The cabin you build afterward does. She sure wasn't thankful for her family's betrayal. She refused to fake a single smile for pain that stole so much from her. Yet here she stood on this high ridge, wearing new spring boots, planning to fix up a homestead that belonged to her in every way. Standing beside a partner who actually stepped up when it counted, and tomorrow at sunrise, she was breaking ground on a garden. That mountain light was painting something truly magical. She wasn't just surviving the frontier anymore. She was finally living. Garrett unhitched the pack mule hauling supplies indoors. He stopped in that rough doorway, glancing back at her, planted firm out in the clearing. You coming in? In a minute. He studied her the way a man studies a mystery he's eager to solve. Never impatient, just paying attention. He went inside and gave her that quiet minute because that's exactly the man he was. She figured out a long time ago that this was one of his finest, rarest qualities. She lingered in that fading mountain twilight, just letting the wild peace wash over her completely, shadows turning bitter cold under the pines. That hidden creek rushing below, sounding clean and wonderfully constant. Those rugged peaks gripping their final hour of color above the timberline. Then she turned, walked inside and pulled that heavy door tight. A good fire blazed. The coffee pot was hot. She sat back, pulled off those heavy boots, and started studying her list of what frontier chore came next. We both know it was mighty long. But she was itching to tackle every single part.